Okay, so I have a student having difficulty with a certain aspect of his model, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to put in these feet on his mouse, so little mice feet. And if you take a look at your mouse, a computer mouse, and I know you're holding on to it, if you just take it and turn it over and take a look at that, what we're looking at here are going to be these structures down here that are going to contain these little gliding paths, pads, I should say, on the bottom of the mouse. So those pads are designed to reduce the surface area of the bottom of the mouse, so you can actually move that mouse around with without a whole lot of resistance. It's also designed to to have a gliding surface. So the material on this pad is going to be a little bit different than the material of the mouse. And I'm going to show you how to use those both. So the desire here is twofold: to be able to create a model in here and some sketch elements in here that are consistent from the front to the back, and also to have that very same geometry available in order to create the pad itself. So you can put these two elements together into the same assembly. So how do we do that? I mean, what it is, you sketched these out on the top and then mirrored them over here. Didn't have them fully defined, which is probably kind of a problem because eventually they're going to kind of stretch out and kind of break on you. You want to make sure that everything is fully defined. And of course, when you get to the point where you're actually telling somebody how to make it, and you don't have any dimensions on it, then people are going to be scratching their head wondering, well, how big is that? What's the form like? So you definitely have to fully define it. So he was having difficulty with it, and I think a solution to that is to create a block in order to define this a little bit better, and take that block as a loose element in here, as a loose sketch element in there, and define it with distance relationships in here, like dimensions, and with an angular dimension in here too, in order to define that both on the top and the bottom. Of course, if you split this in half, you can take whatever you sketched on one side and mirror it to the other side. So let me show you how that was put together. We take our rollback bar and go back to the base. It's just a regular, base feature in here. Kind of looks like a peanut in a way. And I shelled the top of it so that the bottom of it, when we look at the bottom down here, we can put in sketch blocks for that pad. Of course, in here on this feature, we're not going to be creating a pad. We're going to be creating in kind of the walls that are going to be put in place so that the pad can be glued inside of this. So how does that work? So we have our mouse feet base in here. If we look inside of that, we have a sketch. Inside of that sketch are going to be our blocks. So here are our 4 blocks. And with the sketch blocks are kind of like sketches within sketches. There's a certain hierarchy here, and it's kind of on the bottom of the rung here. And as we go up to sketch 2 and eventually up to mouse feet base, as it gets incorporated into the feature manager tree, that's kind of how we're looking at the hierarchy here. So if we right click in sketch 2 and tell it to edit that sketch, you'll notice that these blocks are still gray in the background. But these blocks are all contained. So if we were to click on one element of that block with the control key and copy that, move that out, now you can see that a little bit more clearly what we have in here. But the nice thing about these blocks is they have a lot of mobility to them. They're really loose. It's kind of like a sketch entity all by itself with a lot of different sketch entities incorporated within that. So we can rotate this around too. So if we want to maybe temporarily click on that point in here, go to the fix button. Now we can rotate it around that button in there, around that point there in the middle. And now we can apply, after we get rid of that fix, if we get that rotated in just the right manner, now we can actually apply that onto our model. So we could take this, maybe move this down, and provide some dimensions on that. So maybe a distance relationship like between that point and over here, we can make that 15 millimeters. Between this point over here and maybe this line up here, that kind of defines that bounding box in a way. We're going to make that 33 millimeters. And to get this fully defined, we have that minus sign over here in our sketch 2. And go back to Smart Dimension, maybe create a dimension between that line and that line, the line of our block. And that line which defines that bounding box in a way, maybe make that 13 degrees. Now that's going to be fully defined. So our minus sign in that sketch 2 is gone. And once we get that block inserted and put it into place with the appropriate dimensions in here, if we go ahead and rebuild that, now we have that extra feature. So in a way, we can populate this with that same sketch entity, that sketch block, throughout our model, throughout this feature, and it'll go ahead and generate that for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to put all of our effort into that sketch block, get that exactly the way we want that, and then we're going to go ahead and reload that or load that again into this base model in order to get that defined. So what we don't have to do is to redefine those sketch elements over and over and over again. Once we get that defined in a block, it's easy to insert that, easy to fully define that in order to get that feature created. Okay, so let's take this our example here, and let's kind of look at this a little bit closer. Let's take a look at our block a little bit closer. So we have in here, just out of that sketch 2, we have our mouse feet block 1, and the dash 1 means that's the first instance we put in there. And we have 2, 3, 4, and then 5, that one. So probably don't really want that, so one advantage of this is we could just take that block and delete that. We don't have to go in here and edit the feature or go in here and edit the sketch. We can just go ahead and delete that block and it'll just take that right out of there. That's one advantage, and we're going to cover some other advantages of using sketch blocks in here too. But if we go to Control Tab and go back to our original sketch, which defines that, we have our what I call the mouse feet sketch block example in here, and that we're going to go ahead and create that here in just a moment. But let me show you what's here as existing that we used. So we only have one sketch as part of our part in here, and inside that sketch is one instance of our mouse feet block, and that's -1 for the one and only instance in here. So to edit that, if we were to right click on our sketch 1 and go to edit sketch, doesn't appear to be doing anything. It's still gray. Like what do we do here? If you think about this, that block is going to be a sketch within a sketch. So we have to go down to that next level down here. We can right click on that mouse feet block 1, or double click on the line that's associated with it, and now we can get that those elements in here. So doesn't look like my sketch relations are on in here. So let's go ahead and turn those on, because we should have a lot of them. But one thing you want to make sure that you do here when you put your block together is one thing you can't do. Let's start out with that. You can't actually make a relationship with the origin, so it's always going to be blue, which means it's always going to be like underdefined. It's very kind of learning class. If we could take the midpoint of this right here in the middle of that block where the center lines are and actually move that around, notice that the center lines are moving around too and getting kind of distorted, but we could always take the endpoints of the center lines and move those back, or if we want to do that, we can put in some arbitrary dimensions on those to make sure that they don't move. But one thing you'll notice here too, if we were to take some of these other blue points and move those around, that it is staying continuous. It's not stretching. It's not, it's moving around per the screen, but it's not stretching in any way, which means it implies that it is going to be fully defined when we go ahead and rebuild this. What you can't do in here is take this point in here and try to pick up the origin and make a relationship in here. It's just not going to let us do that. It won't let us do it because it's on the bottom of the feature, or bottom of the hierarchy down here. But what it does when we rebuild that, watch how this moves, and I don't even think that's where the origin is. I think the origin is probably going to be over here. If we rebuild that, it's going to put it right back where the origin is. So we're going to right click in our sketch in here. We can take a look at the only two sketch relations we have in here. Let's go ahead and delete those and take that block and maybe move that out of the way. And when it comes to the point where you can actually take that block and move that around while you're in the sketch environment and not in the block environment, we could actually take the center of that and park that right on top of the origin. So now we can. So that block is sitting on top of the origin. We can take that block and move that around a little bit. We can apply one more relationship in here and make that vertical, and now it's going to be fully defined and won't be able to move. So we can try to take these endpoints of these center lines in here, try to move those around, it's not going to move. If we were to get rid of that vertical relationship, it could spin around here. If we were to do that, we have that negative sign for our sketch 1. And as an opposition to what we did before, we could actually take this line and make that horizontal, and it'll do the same thing. Now it's going to be fully defined. If we try to move that around, it's not going to allow us to do that. That minus sign is still there, but if we rebuild that minus sign will disappear. So that's how you play with blocks. And one more thing about blocks, let's go ahead and go back into that sketch. Let's just take this block and delete that. And just consider that block as being like a sketch entity. All you have to do is click on one portion of it to highlight it and go to delete, and it'll get rid of that. But if we have our block toolbar out, and if you right click in your command manager, you can find your block toolbar in here. And typically the block toolbar is fairly small, so what I like to do is just like have it float. Otherwise it's going to be down at the bottom over here, or maybe to the right of your command manager. To me it's a little bit easier just to let that float. So one option in here, we're going to cover that here probably in the next segment of the video. I'm going to show you how to put together a block like this. But once we have that block created, insert block is the next command. So we have our mouse feet block in here, and we're going to deliberately do this when we create our block. We're going to make sure that the center of the block here is going to be where the insertion point is, and the insertion point is always going to be underneath the cursor. that gives us the capacity right away to be able to apply that to existing sketch geometry or model geometry that we might have in the background. The only sketch or model geometry that you have in here is going to be the origin. So we're going to go ahead and drop that on the origin in here. And it's going to allow us to put in multiple blocks in here too, depending on how many times we click the cursor. But with that one block created, we're going to go ahead and delete these other ones. It still has the flexibility of being able to rotate around. So this is where we're going to take that horizontal relationship, apply that in here. And if we were to rebuild our model again, that sketch 1, which had the minus sign on it next to it before, is now going to be fully defined. If we try to move that around, it's not going to let us do that. So that, in a nutshell, is how a block is manipulated within a part, within the sketch portion of that part. And in the next section, we're going to talk about how to create a block like this. Okay, so in this segment, we're going to talk about how to create a block. And we're going to start a block just like we would a normal drawing. We're going to put in all of our geometry in here. We're going to mirror from one side to the other, make sure it has a relationship with the origin in the middle, even though the block will not have that ultimately. We're going to do that initially. We're just going to initiate a sketch and use all those sketch tools and sketch commands that that we're used to in order to make this fully defined initially. And then we're going to make a block out of it. So we're going to start with our the appropriate plane in here, which is going to be the top plane. And we're going to go to we'll just go up to the sketch tab on the command manager, and we're going to begin to sketch this. So typically, we start with a couple center lines. We're going to get the origin is going to show here. So we're going to take a center line. We're going to go through the center of the origin horizontally, and then vertically, kind of exaggerate this a little bit. And another way of doing this is we can, instead of putting center lines in here, we could do a midpoint line. Because we're going to want to put a point right here in the middle. And sometimes I don't like having those extra points in there, because sometimes you'll take that center line and delete that center line, and that point will be there and it'll be underdefined, and sometimes it'll float around and make your whole sketch underdefined. You won't be able to find because points are hard to find. But that's a different video at a different time. But we're going to take that center line and that midpoint line. We're going to make that for construction. So now we do have a point in the middle. So we're going to take that point and this line in here, and we're going to make that midpoint too. So now when we stretch out our center lines, we're still going to have that point in the middle. So let's do this. We're going to put in an arc on the top, maybe a 3-point arc. We're just going to arbitrarily sketch that out. We're going to go over the center a little bit, and we're going to take the midpoint of this, right-click on that. We're going to select the midpoint. We're going to put it right on top of that line. We're going to make that coincident. We're also going to make sure that the center of the arc is going to be on that center line too. So I'm going to put a dimension of that. We're going to make that maybe 2.5. Well, it says it's 25, but it's going to be 2.5 millimeters. And we want to make sure we're in millimeter seconds, so we're going to do this whole model in millimeters. Now we're going to take our second arc in here, and we're going to do a tangent arc. Now I'm going over halfway here, just to make sure we can maintain these relationships that we have in here. So we're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to take that tangent arc and exaggerate that and put that over the side. And we're going to take, again, we're going to right-click on this, select the midpoint. We're going to put that on the horizontal line. We're going to make that coincident. We want to make sure that the center point of that arc and that horizontal line are going to be coincident here too. So now this has the capacity to move it around a little bit. And if you take these points in here, we should be able to move that. There we go. That kind of looks good. And we can also take these arcs too and move those around. So now we're going to apply some dimensions in here that's going to better define this. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put in points in here. We're going to exaggerate this again. We're going to put a point over here and a point over here. And we're going to take this point over here and put that on that line, or maybe the midpoint of that arc. We're going to make that coincident. The reason why we're doing this is we're going to put in some dimensions in here between that point and the center lines. So now we're going to take a smart dimension. We're going to go between this point and that center line. And we're going to put in that value. This is going to be 8. And then between this point and that center line, we're going to go over halfway. And what that does is it's going to define the whole width and length of that. We're going to drop that in. We're going to make that 13. So now we have that partially put in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the top, mirror it to the bottom. We're going to take the left and mirror it to the right. So let's do that. We're going to take these two elements in here and that center line, and we're going to mirror that. When we do that, what that does, instead of, it does create that on the bottom, but there's always this thought that we're going to have this arc over here right on top of the arc that we're trying to mirror on the bottom. But SolidWorks is smart enough now that if we did something like that, it's not going to do that. And we know that for two reasons, because that arc in here, it's got a good, bold, solid line to it. It would be thin otherwise if it was stacked on top of another one. But we could also double check that too. If we were to take that arc and delete that, it's gone. It's the only one in place. And of course, the CAD person's best tool here is do Control-Z. That brings us back to the condition that we were in before. So we're going to do the same thing. All we have to do really is to take this arc in here and mirror it to the other side. So we already have the top arc and the bottom arc down here. We're going to take that left arc over here and mirror it to the right. So we're going to click on that arc, that center line. We're going to go to, we're going to mirror that over. And bing, now we have enclosed geometry in SolidWorks 2018. It actually creates a color in here, kind of a light purple color in a way. It shows us that we have enclosed geometry, and we don't have any other sketch entities in here that are overlapping each other. So with that in place, now we have the beginnings of our sketch block. Okay, so we're almost ready to create that block. So what we want to do is we want to create, in order to get that wall in here, we want to have enclosed geometry that's kind of on the edge. So we're going to have to define the inside and the outside of the wall, where the inside is going to be kind of like a donut hole in a way. So let's take some of these dimensions, move these out a little bit so we can see these a little bit better. And contrary to our example for that block that you saw before, let's actually put in some dimensions on these lines so it doesn't move around. And these are arbitrary dimensions. They mean nothing to anything. They just keep these lines from moving. So we're going to make that 20. We're going to make this 15. And it might be kind of confusing to have all these dimensions in here, but it does keep these center lines from moving around. But the dimensions we're really looking at here is going to be that 8mm dimension, 13mm tall, and 2.5 millimeters for that top arc. And everything else kind of falls into place. So what we want to do is we want to do an offset. We're going to offset to the inside, so these are going to be maximum dimensions. So all we have to do is go to the offset entities, not going to be 10 millimeters, but maybe a half a millimeter, 0.5. Let's see what that looks like. So we're going to go ahead and click on one of these arcs in here. It kind of shows it propagating to the outside. But again, if we just click our mouse on the inside, bing, now it puts it on the inside. So now you can see two different colors in here. We have still that light purple color, and still kind of a light color purple in here, but a little bit darker than that. Kind of shows us two areas of enclosed geometry. Of course, when we go ahead and do our extrude on this thing, we're going to go only worry about this space in between those two areas of enclosed geometry. So with that in place, it's like fully defined. Everything's black. We don't have a negative sign next to our sketch. And just to verify that, if we go ahead and rebuild that, still doesn't have a negative sign into it, we're going to go ahead and re-edit that. And now we're going to create our blocks. This is what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and select everything. With the block toolbar out, what we want to do is we want to go to Make Block. We're going to go ahead and click on that. And this might seem a little obscure, but we want to make sure that we have our insertion point right there in the middle. So we have the origin right there in the middle, but watch this. We're going to watch where that origin goes when we actually create this block. We're going to go to Insertion Point, and there's our insertion point. It's kind of like right up here in the upper left-hand corner of like the bounding box that would contain everything within that block. But we're going to take that insertion point and drag that down here and make a coincident relationship with that point. That's right there in the middle of our sketch entities that we have in there. Once we do that, go to the green check mark. Now we have our block in place. So now we can change the name of that block. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to call this our mouse feet, not moused, but mouse feet block. If we can spell, we're going to go ahead and create, I'll call that B-L-O-C-K. And then if you just click off to the right over here, it solidifies that. So that's the name of the block. And now watch this. We have a couple different relationships in here. The block is actually turned gray in the background, but if we go ahead and rebuild this and go back into our sketch 1, let's take a look at this. So now we have our sketch 1, it's got a minus sign on it. If we go ahead and edit that block, we have a couple coincident relationships in here. We have a midpoint over here and a coincident up here, a midpoint and coincident up here. But just like you would with other sketch entities in here, and consider this block as its own sketch entity, let's take some of these points in here and actually move that around. So looks like if we just take the midpoint in here and drag that to the origin in here, it should get it fully defined. So let's go ahead and see that, see if that helped. Didn't. We went ahead and rebuilt that, so let's go back into the sketch and see what else we need to do. Let's go ahead and click on some of these points and see what we need to do here. So it has the capacity to actually rotate around. So kind of like before, we're going to go ahead and take that line, we're going to make that horizontal. So I'm not certain what these relationships are. We have a midpoint relationship in here and a coincident relationship. Let's see what that does. So there's a coincident relationship maybe between that point and that center line, midpoint between this arc, and I can't see the other relationship in here too, but I think if we just delete those, I don't think we really need those. I don't think it helps define our model. This right now with the sketch block that we have in place inside that sketch, it should be fully defined. So let's go and rebuild that. And part of the desire here is try to keep this as simple as possible. You don't want to have too many relationships in here that might eventually just over-define the model. So we have that coincident relationship with the point in there with the origin in here, and then we have our horizontal relationship that should be fully defined. If we go ahead and rebuild that, our sketch 1 now is fully defined. So let's go back into that, and let's go into the block itself and make edits to that block. So if we were to double click inside of that, you'll notice that that's blue now. It used to be black. And that's because that relationship with the origin is no longer there. We could actually take that block and move that around. So there's our, actually that's our insertion point. That green dot in here that we see in there, that's actually the insertion point. We don't want to move that, so let's go and establish a coincident relationship with the center in there with the point that's already in there. So we're going to keep that in place. But if we were to take some of these other points in here and move those around, we kind of lost some of our relationships that we had before. So we definitely don't want something like that. So let's do Control Z and get that back there. What we want to do now at this point, once the block is created, is we're going to put in those relationships back in there. So one thing to keep in mind when you create blocks like this, you want to make sure that a lot of your horizontal and vertical sketch relationships that you had in here before, you want to get rid of those as best you can. Because if you were to take that block and rotate it around and then explode that block later inside of another sketch, inside of another feature, inside of another part, that could be troublesome. If this line were to be initially horizontal and then is suddenly in an orientation that was not horizontal, then you're going to have an error there you might have to correct. So we're going to take a look at some of these sketch relationships a little bit later. When you do create blocks like this, a lot of times those sketch relationships that were in there before get deleted. But we're going to show you some ways to get around that here in just a moment. So we're going to make some modifications to our block in here, and one thing you'll notice that if you look at all of our sketch relations in here, we have a lot of symmetric relationships in here, which all are defined here in the middle. We have a midpoint relationship in here with that point. We also have a coincident relationship with the insertion point that should be in there too. And you'll also notice that each one of these arcs in here, at least this outside series of arcs with the Centerlines in there, that's fully defined because we know we can move that around and nothing gets changed. But this over here, this is a little bit troublesome. That probably don't want that. So what we're going to do, when we created that block, it actually got rid of that dimension and that offset sketch relation that we had in there. And just kind of got rid of that, so we're left with this what appears to be a blob. So we're going to go ahead and take that blob and delete that. We're going to reestablish this. So now that we have our sketch block already created, let's go ahead and do that offset entity yet one more time, exactly the way we did that before. So 0.5 millimeter, we're going to go ahead and click on that. It's going to go ahead and select the chain, click on the inside in here. So now we have that 0.5 millimeter dimension in here. We have our offset entity sketch relation that we see in here. If we go ahead and rebuild that, the blocks are going to be in place. It puts it right back in the origin the way we had it before. Let's go ahead and right click on our sketch 1 and just to make sure of that. And if we go ahead and while we're in that sketch, double click on these entities that define that block. Now we have those in place. So now if we move this around as a block just to kind of see if it's fully defined, it is. It still is fully defined. And we seem to have lost this dimension over here in regard to the length of that. If you remember before, kind of arbitrary dimension on that center line, we're going to make that 20. So now when we move this around, it all moves around as a block. So in a way, that's a way to determine whether this is going to be fully defined when we put that in place. So we're going to go ahead and double click on that or rebuild that. And then we're going to go back inside of that. And one way to get into the edit that sketch block, if we double click on that, gets us into the sketch. Double click again, gets us into that sketch block. Now we have the 20 millimeter dimension over here, 15 millimeter dimension, arbitrary dimensions for the center lines, both for the horizontal and vertical ones, and all the other dimensions in here that define that. And it looks like our block is ready to be exported. Okay, so now that our block is continuous, it's complete, it's got everything in there that we need, it isn't stretching us, so we can determine that we've already determined that it's got to be fully defined when we import that into our other drawing, or other part, I should say. Let's go ahead and export that. So what you want to do is you just want to click on mouse feet block -1. It's just going to copy mouse feet block. We're going to do Control C on that. Now we're going to go back to our other part. We're going to insert that. So we're going to go ahead and click on the surface. We're going to go to Sketch, and we're just going to go to Control V, and there's our block. So the block is going to be continuous here, and again, if we just double click on it just to make sure, we have our dimensions in here, 25 half millimeter dimension offset in here. We have our offset sketch entity, and these other dimensions in here, which actually define the outside elliptical shape in a way, which is 13.8, and then that top arc at 2.5. So everything looks complete. Let's go ahead and double click that. Or another way here with our sketch block or block toolbar over here, we can just click on Edit Block. And that takes us back to the sketch. So we're still in the sketch. So what we want to do is we want to put in some sketch entities in here that's going to help us define this. So let's go ahead and put in our Centerlines in here, top and bottom, horizontal and vertical ones. So we're going to go ahead and select the midpoint of that. We're not going to put in a point in the middle of that, but we're going to go ahead and make the center of that vertical center line right at the origin. We're going to go ahead and double click on that, or right click on that, and we're going to select the midpoint in this and go back to the origin. We're going to make that coincident, and this time we're going to put in kind of a bounding box in a way, or box around this thing, and we're going to define that a little bit better, because I think when you have a situation like this with where you're defining this, it's really kind of difficult to define it by way of the center. It might be easier to define that by the edge of the mouse itself. So we're going to go ahead and sketch out that rectangle. We're going to make it for construction. And now we're going to put in some other elements in here. So we're going to take that line and maybe this edge. We're going to make that tangent. And we're going to do that around all four corners. So we're going to make that tangent. And we could conceivably just complete this by selecting the midpoint of that line and making this coincident. That'll kind of get that edge in place. And this one too, this is that'll actually do that because we have a symmetric relationship in here, but here we can't. I don't think we can. So we're going to go ahead and take that line and that edge, that arc, and we're going to make that tangent. So now we have the capacity to actually do something with this. So we're going to go ahead and put this in place. Now we need to rotate that around and kind of get that in pretty close to the position we think it should be in order to get this the mouse foot pad wall in place. And what we want to do probably initially is maybe kind of get that rotated. And it's kind of hard to do that. We can move that around, but you can't really rotate that. So one way to get around that is to apply a fixed relationship in here, at least temporarily. So we're going to take the center of that, and we're going to fix that. And then once we do that, once we get that kind of in an orientation that we like, now we're going to go ahead and take that sketch block and move that around a little bit. And now we can apply some distance relationships and one angular dimension in here too. So we're going to go between that point and this line over here, and that's really close to 13, so we're going to keep that relationship. This point and this line over here, we're going to make sure you don't go over it. When you go on this side, that will give us that double dimension. And that's almost 15, so we're going to make that 15. And the last thing you want to do is maybe between this line and that line, we're going to put an angle in there, and that's, gosh, it looks like it's right at 37. So we're going to go ahead and keep that. So that puts our first block in place. What about our second block? Let's put a block in down here, and then we're going to take both of those blocks and we're going to mirror them to the other side. So one way to do that is we can go to Insert Block, and it gives us that same block. We can drop it in down there. It's got the same orientation that that one does. Or, as an alternative to that, we could just click on a sketch entity within that block, and with the Control key to press, just go ahead and drag that down here. Once we have that in place, let's go ahead and again temporarily put in that fixed relationship in here. Kind of rotate that around a little bit. And we're going to take that fixed relationship and get that out of there. Now we're going to define this a little bit better. So maybe about right there would be good. So again, smart dimension between this point and that line over here. That's about 13, so we're going to go ahead and keep that. Between this point and that line over here, we're going to keep it on this side. We're going to make that about 12, so that's a little bit different from the top. And then maybe between this line in here and that line over here, we're going to make that about 43 degrees. Again, all these could be altered and modified as you put your model together. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and take that sketch block, this sketch block, that line, and we're going to mirror that to the other side. So now we have symmetry in place, and let's go ahead and create our feature. So we're going to do features, extruded boss space. Maybe we'll go up by 0.5 millimeter here too. Now we're going to go ahead and select what we need to select in here. So you can see the yellow preview in here. So it's already going to select the inside between those two enclosed spaces of geometry, areas of geometry. And if we turn that sideways, we can see what it's going to do. And so we can see that rise in there, and that looks like it's going to be pretty good. Draft angle, because this is a plastic part, probably want to put in a draft angle, maybe 3 degrees would be good. And you want to make sure it's drafting to the right side, so it looks like it's drafting to the inside. If it's hard to see, you can put in a bigger angle in there so you can see what that looks like. And maybe 3 degrees would be good. Now that we see that the orientation of that is going to be correct, we go to the green check mark, bang, now we have that in place. Okay, so now that we have this in place, we have our sketch block in place, which is to define our mouse feet wall. Let's go and rename our feature and actually put that in place. So if we slowly click on that feature, we can call that mouse feet walls. And with that, we were to put this together into an assembly. We're not going to do this in this video, but we want to make sure that we put the mouse feet pads in here too. So we could actually use that very same sketch that we use in order to create that block to create the pad itself. And if you think about this, the blocks that are in here, and I'm going to go ahead and rebuild that while we have this here, our mouse feet block over here, and this one is still the same as a mouse feet block within our other part that we had that we actually created this from, but they're independent of each other. So if I were to rename this and maybe change some dimensions inside that block, that would be independent of the other blocks. So keep that in mind, because we can go back to our original sketch which defined this block and actually create our pad out of that. So we could actually take that sketch, go to extruded boss space, and define that a little bit better. We don't want to do a thin extrude on that, but in regard to the contours, we're going to go ahead and select the inside of this. And we're going to make that maybe 1/2 inch or 1/2 millimeter tall in order to create that pad. And 1/2 millimeter probably isn't the right value. Maybe 0.7 would be. So we're going to make that a little bit taller in order to make that, ensure that that pad actually exceeds by maybe 0.2 millimeters from the wall that we have in the bottom of the mouse. So if we do that, if we go to the green check mark, now we have our mouse feet pads. So let's go ahead and rename that. We're going to call that mouse feet pads. And that's our feature. We probably should call that our part that too. But one thing about this, because the sketch block is independent, we can go into that sketch block, select that sketch block over here. We can edit that sketch block by not save it. Don't insert it, but we want to edit that sketch block. So if we go right into that sketch block, what we want to do is we want to make sure that that fits within the walls that we've defined on the bottom of the mouse. We could do that by taking this dimension in here and maybe making that 0.7. So now that pad's going to be just slightly smaller than the edge of the walls. If we do that, if we go to the rebuild button, now we have a pad that's going to put that in place. So we have the pad, we have the walls for the pad to go into on the bottom of our mouse are all editable. And because of those sketch blocks in place, we can go into those sketch blocks and make changes in those dimensions in there and have the whole model update. So that kind of gives you a kind of a brief tour of some of the advantages of using sketch blocks. It allows you to take those sketch blocks and put those into a model that might have angular dimensions to it. It allows it to be fully defined, and it comes together as like one big sketch entity that you could easily mirror from one side to the other. So it's really, really convenient using sketch blocks in a manner like this.